psychic break that out of nowhere, all around you is not what you foretold. You never see it coming.
Cool! Looking cool, Joker!
Looking cool, Spider-Man. Looking cool indeed. Anyways, welcome back, true believers and all you spectacular Spidey fans, to another very exciting episode of Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales 101. Now, recently, we have been heavily diving into quite a lot of interesting gameplay mechanics that Miles Morales will feature. This, of course, was mainly thanks to Game Informer's amazing cover story, as well as the brand new incredible bits of gameplay that we have received of Miles Morales in action. Not to mention the editor-in-chief of Game Informer himself, Andrew Reiner, going on Twitter to answer a plethora of fan questions, which surprisingly did provide a lot of insight to Miles Morales by showcasing details of the game that weren't necessarily featured in the main cover story. But one massive element that we haven't necessarily covered yet, coming from Game Informer themselves, is actually in regards to the story. And the core reason as to why exactly I haven't fully covered this topic yet is because it does include some spoilers. Or to be more specific, this news does go over some spoilers of Miles Morales from the very beginning of the game. And if you're someone who's also a major fan of alternate suits within Spider-Man games, we also get some story descriptions of 2 other alternate suits that will be featured in Miles Morales that we have not seen yet. So if you're someone who wants to go in absolutely blind for Miles Morales, I would actually recommend to not watch this video and instead simply wait until more footage of the game is released. But on the flip side, I will say that the majority of these spoilers don't necessarily ruin anything too huge that is going to be featured in Miles Morales' plot. And again, all this information is prominently featured within Game Informer's cover story, so it's not like we're going to be talking about any massive leaks that do relate to the main plot. But regardless, I still just wanted to put in that slight spoiler warning so that way you're all prepared ahead of time. And to jump into the news right off the bat, we do have an official confirmation as to exactly where Peter Parker is during the events of Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. Now yes, we've already seen cutscenes of both Miles and Peter teaming up with each other in order to try and make sure Rhino is still held captive. But as it turns out, that event actually takes place at the very beginning of the game. And after the entire happenstance occurs, that is when Miles is left all by himself. But as for exactly how Miles ends up getting to that point, we do have a full description from Game Informer's cover story breaking everything down. And to specifically talk about the location of Peter Parker within Miles Morales, Game Informer does go on to describe, in this slow moment shared between the new Spider-Man and the new looking Spider-Man, Peter hands Miles a present and asks him to recite the Spider-Man oath. I promise to do everything in my power to protect this city, as Miles says back to his teacher, who obviously just made it up as a joke. He then breaks some bad news to Miles, saying that Mary Jane is heading to Symkaria for a few weeks to cover peace talks for the Daily Bugle, and that he is joining her as her photographer. Miles is rightfully overwhelmed by the news, but Peter continues poking at his friend. So in case you missed it, one of my good buddies and fellow Spidey Squad member Carlos Escobosa and myself did do a video discussing exactly where we think Peter Parker could be within the events of Miles Morales. And as it seems to be right on the money, one of our theories was indeed that Peter was going to join Mary Jane in Symkaria, especially considering the fact at the very end of the Silver Lining DLC in Spider-Man PS4, MJ did let Peter know via phone call that she was actually going to travel to Symkaria in order to uncover more of the truth about what exactly is going on over there for the Daily Bugle. Although, given the fact that Miles Morales does take place 1 year after the events of the Silver Lining DLC, it seems that Mary Jane did decide to stay in Symkaria after she initially traveled there. And knowing that Peter himself is traveling to Symkaria in order to be Mary Jane's photographer for the Daily Bugle is a very interesting plot decision to say the least. And even though I do think this explanation of Peter not being within New York City during the events of Miles Morales' story is fine on its own, I sincerely hope the overall role that Peter is filling in right now as a photographer doesn't carry over into the inevitable sequel of Marvel's Spider-Man 2. One of the greatest aspects about Spider-Man PS4 is that Peter Parker's characterization was nothing like we've ever seen before, and making him a recent college graduate working as a scientist alongside of Otto Octavius was one of the best decisions Insomniac Games ever made to the Peter Parker character. So if anything, I really hope that the writers over at Insomniac do decide to continue down that path once we do receive more of Peter's story in the official sequel. And even though Peter would obviously not be working at Octavius Industries anymore, I would hope that instead they still focus on more of the scientific route that Peter could potentially find a job in. And whether or not that might mean that Peter could work at another scientific company like that of Oscorp, or even acting as a teacher's assistant at Midtown High School in order to keep more tabs on Miles, we'll just have to wait and see as to what exactly Insomniac decides to do with Peter's character in the future. But speaking of the Daily Bugle, Insomniac Games did release their third main news report within the universe of Marvel's Spider-Man, where this time around they did go in to analyze the main energy corporation that is going to have a massive role within the game, none other than Roxxon. And alongside of receiving a lot more awesome info about Roxxon as a whole, we also get a tease as to who could potentially be one of the main antagonists. And this time around, instead of being written by Robbie Robertson, we do have the main story coming from Kat Farrell, with photos by Sean Besman, where the title reads, "Red Giant Goes Green. Roxxon shifts from traditional energy to be a revolutionary new product." It wasn't so long ago that mega corporation Roxxon Energy announced a shuffle in its executive leadership, naming Simon Krieger as the new head of research and development. Young, ambitious, and charismatic, Krieger quickly convinced the old-fashioned officials to reorganize Roxxon's labs and prioritize clean energy initiatives that he believed could save the world. Now, the new Roxxon executive has come forward with a breakthrough. He claims to have developed a brand new form of energy that promises zero byproducts and could power parts of New York City for centuries. Krieger dubbed his invention Newform. He was quick to report that the new energy passed quote-unquote extensive testing, with flying colors, although what tests were conducted remains a mystery, and is preparing to bring the new energy to New York City. The company's rapid consumption of NYC real estate has claimed a new neighborhood, none other than East Harlem. According to Krieger, this new site will reportedly be the first to use the Newform reactor. While many East Harlem residents are skeptical towards its safety, the new head of research and development has assured them it's the solution to the blight of power outages that have plagued the neighborhood. So not only does this brand new Daily Bugle news report provide some very interesting insight to the company of Roxxon as a whole, but it also introduces us to one of the main heads of Roxxon himself, none other than Simon Krieger, who is a very prominent character within the Marvel Comics. And to give you all a brief synopsis as to who exactly Simon Krieger is within the Marvel Comics universe, he was previously the vice president to Republic Oil and Natural Gas, before it became Roxxon. And believe it or not, even though Simon does have a very prominent placement within the Roxxon board members, it turns out that he was actually fully responsible for the deaths of Howard and Maria Stark, which was all in a plot to take over Stark Industries. So in short, Simon Krieger is a pretty bad guy, and seeing how he has such a big role within Roxxon is going to be very intriguing to see exactly where his narrative inclusion will be once we play the game for ourselves. And speaking of playing the game, one of the biggest assets that Miles Morales will feature, just like Spider-Man PS4 did, is surely going to be the insanely fun and exciting method of unlocking brand new suits for Miles to wear. And I do have to give a major shout out to massive Spidey fan and fellow Twitter user Mr. Sandman for actually sharing this screenshot with me from the Game Informer magazine, where not only did the cover story break down all the currently known suits that we do have of Miles Morales so far, but it also provided us with some story details as to how exactly each suit is incorporated within the game's narrative. Now, as for the main suits that we already have complete confirmation of, let's begin with the one that we have seen the most of, is obviously Miles Morales' black and red iconic suit. Just like how the advanced suit was the main costume Peter wore throughout the duration of Spider-Man PS4's story, the same thing is going to apply for the black and red suit for Miles Morales. And on top of that, we also have one of the main pre-order costumes of the tracksuit, followed by the now named beginner suit, which was showcased during the very first Daily Bugle news report, as well as the recently revealed 2020 comic variant suit of Miles Morales, which again does look like a mix of Spider-Man with Daft Punk. And to top it all off with the brand new gameplay footage, we also have what's now being called the Cat suit, where Miles is in fact wearing a different variation of his black and red suit alongside of a red hoodie and of course a backpack holding none other than Spider-Cat. And apparently this specific costume is going to be the only suit in the game where you can have Spider-Cat accompany you when fighting enemies. And let me tell you, when I first saw the footage of Spider-Cat attacking the enemy alongside of Miles, I completely lost my mind. And that is easily going to be one of my go-to suits to wear within the game. But to provide a bit more context to the suits as a whole, we do have a full-on description from the Game Informer cover story, which does break down one other costume which we haven't seen yet. Players unlock a variety of different looks for Miles as the adventure unfolds. The number of suits isn't as high as it was in the first game, both from the story not not being as long and from the fact that Marvel hasn't created that many for Miles in his 9 years of existence. Most of the suits come with mods that give the players different abilities, and also new visor mods that allow Miles to see different things, where in this case, one of the examples is highlighted enemies. One visor mod even makes more gadget ammo drop. The thinking is that the visor helps him spot in the environment. Since Miles is a new character, Insomniac didn't alter his look too much like they did with Peter's advanced suit. They want people to connect with a similar look to what is currently in the comics. In our demo, we saw 6 different suits in action, and as of writing this, Insomniac didn't want to divulge the potential mods they deliver. And given the 5 previous suits that we already went over, the final one on the list that Game Informer describes is called the Gift Suit. And based on the earlier description of Peter Parker's involvement in the beginning of the game, this suit surely sounds like the gift that statement was referring to. Because as the costume's description goes on to state, true to the name, this suit is gifted to Miles as his first full-blown Spider-Man getup. It isn't armored or advanced like Peter's latest threads, and instead looks like a pair of pajamas. The colors are Spider-Man's traditional red and blue, with a little more blue than normal. And as a good comparison, this does sound a little bit similar to the Halloween costume that we see Miles wear within the Ultimate Comics. But knowing that Peter is gifting this suit to Miles, it's surely going to be a very interesting experience to see exactly how Miles reacts to the costume in the first place. And as a little bonus, even though this suit wasn't necessarily described within the Game Informer post, it was previously leaked by a legal Sony statement that the Into the Spider-Verse suit is 110% confirmed to be within this game. And given how sensational all the suits currently look like within Miles Morales, I just can't wait to see what the other outfits are going to look like down the line. But to wrap up all of this astounding Miles Morales news, I do want to read a very impactful quote coming from one of the game's main writers, where due to the fact that this is a fully standalone Miles Morales story, one of the main writers over at Insomniac of Evan Narcisse did explain exactly why Miles is so important. And after reading his statement for myself, I think it's safe to say that this game is in good hands. But as Evan goes on to describe, I feel like Miles is an avatar of teenage experience in a way that has advanced so much more than when Peter Parker was a teenager. My shorthand for this basically is saying that I personally believe that Miles as a teenager is cooler than Peter Parker as a teenager. He dresses better than Peter did, he's got friends, and he's got game. Maybe it's not good game, but he can at least talk to someone he's attracted to, whereas Peter could barely manage that. I think he's more connected to the world that surrounds him. Peter Parker early on was a very reactive kind of character. That's part of how he understood teenagers back then, and I think we understand teenagers differently now. They're their own people with their own concerns and ways of moving through the world. Now, even though I think it's going to be a very hard task for Insomniac to try and overcome to possibly make Miles Morales' story better than what Spider-Man PS4 had, I still think the overall narrative that this game will feature is going to be something truly special. And I, for one, can't wait to fully immerse myself within this amazing game once it does release on November 12th. But with all that said, everyone, that's the video I have for you today, and please let me know all your thoughts in the comments section down below. What do you think about these intriguing story details for Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales, and which element about the story are you looking forward to the most? For me personally, I'm actually very curious to see exactly what Roxxon is up to within the overall world of Marvel's New York, especially given the fact that the Tinkerer and the Underground are so fixated on trying to gather the Roxxon new form. I do think there's a lot more to Roxxon than meets the eye. But until the next news update, everyone, thank you all so much for watching. Stay spectacular, Spidey fans. Feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you did enjoy, and without further ado, peace out.
Hey, Teo, got a surprise for you.
Oh yeah? What's that?
Want to reform society?